12 minutes past 8 here now on the Radio Whammo Breakfast.
Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does he agree with John Key, then Leader of Opposition, who on the 28th of September 2008 said, quote, "Let me make this absolutely clear. Under National, the number of teachers will grow," end quote. If so, how does his budget cap on the number of teachers fit with this commitment?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it has grown in the 3.5 years that I've been Prime Minister, and I'm thrilled that the member reads everything that I say.
That was yesterday in the House during question time. Russel Norman, of course, co-leader of the Greens, asking the question there, and he joins us now on the line. Good morning to you, Russell.
Good morning, mate.
Were you happy with that response there from the Prime Minister yesterday?
Well, he wasn't... didn't kind of release all the facts. The facts are that they did grow in the first few years of National, but now they've capped it, and so the number of teachers is going to stay flat, even as the role continues to grow.
Yeah, and what they're saying is that the outcomes from more teachers haven't improved. Sort of everything's stagnated. So they're just moving with the times, I think, was the gist of what the Prime Minister was saying yesterday.
Well, correlation is not causation. What we don't know is the counterfactual. So if the number of teachers had been kept flat from 2008, what would the educational outcomes have looked like? And based on quite a lot of evidence, pretty much all of it that we know that class sizes have an impact on educational outcomes.
Yeah.
And so spending money on class sizes seems to me a pretty sensible thing to do.
And what do you make of the backpedalling now that National have done on the reduction in teachers? They're saying that schools will lose no more than 2 teachers over the next 3 years. That was sort of breaking news before you guys went into the House yesterday.
Yeah, well, what happened is that Treasury designed this policy of cutting the number of teachers in real terms, or, if you like, making larger class sizes. But Treasury don't really understand the education system. And so when they implemented it, what they didn't realise was there was all these technology teachers, and by rolling the technology teachers into the overall formula and then changing the formula, they were going to cut all these technology teachers out of intermediate schools. Like in some places, they're going to lose like 7 teachers or more. And so all of a sudden they realised they had a major problem on their hands that they had. I think they were completely unaware of it, because the people who designed the policy, which is Treasury, aren't experts in education. This is obvious by the fact that they don't seem to think class sizes matter.
So just accountants looking at the ledger, essentially.
Say that again?
So they're just accountants looking at the ledger.
Well, they have some policy knowledge, and they know some things, but clearly they're not experts in education, and I think that was revealed yesterday because they made a big mess of it.
Okay, so where does this leave the government's policy now that they've had to backpedal on this? I mean, does it reduce the harm that the policy, in your opinion, would cause?
It certainly reduces the harm in terms of technology teachers at intermediate level.
Right.
So that's an improvement. But what it doesn't change is that the schools are still going to lose teachers. It's just now they've put a cap of 2 full-time equivalents in terms of the teachers they're going to lose. But if you're in a pretty small school, losing 2 teachers is quite a big deal. If you're in a big school, losing 2 teachers matters less, but in a small school, it's a big deal. So, I mean, in terms of making policy, this is very poor policy making, because it doesn't take into account the size of the school, but that's what you do when you do a patch-up job after you've made a mess of it.
Have the Greens done any research on what is the ideal size of a class?
Well, I don't know off the top of my head. All we know is that there is strong research that correlates class size with educational outcomes.
Wouldn't it be helpful to know the optimum, though, wouldn't it?
I think you're right. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that you're right. But off the top of my head, I don't know what it is.
Okay, let's move on to an external issue to New Zealand. Breaking this morning that 2 Syrian diplomats accredited to New Zealand, but they're in Australia. They've been expelled from Australia over the recent massacre of civilians over there in Syria. It was, of course, recently when more than 100 people were killed, but of course that's part of the total of around about 10,000 at the moment. How would you rate New Zealand's response to the situation in Syria so far, Russell?
Well, I mean, it's been okay. I mean, there's limited amount that New Zealand can do. So, obviously we should join our voices with everyone else. But it's reasonably limited how much we can do. I mean, as I understand it, these Syrian diplomats are accredited to New Zealand, but actually are based in Australia.
Yeah, exactly. So they don't have their own embassy here as such in New Zealand. You don't think that we could have been a louder voice on our own? In the past we've sort of made a stand against things like this around the world and made a noise often before anyone else, but not these days.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we could have been a louder voice, but I mean, the thing about Syria is that because the United States has decided the current regime is bad and are seeking regime change, they're providing quite a bit of leadership on it. The real time that New Zealand's voice, particularly matters is when the United States is backing the brutal dictatorship, which happens often enough. And at times like that, it's critically important that voices like New Zealand are heard. I mean, It's a slightly different situation at the moment because the US has decided to take them on.
Yeah. Okay, and back here in New Zealand, finally, Russell, the government says New Zealand can hold its head high at a global environment summit this year, despite a report finding it failed to meet commitments it made at a similar summit in 1992. John Key, of course, he came out and said, well, look, compared to the rest of the world, we're doing pretty good. I think he did that. He said that in a BBC interview a wee while back as well. Can we be proud of our environmental record over the past 20 years?
Well, no. I mean, it's a shocker. I mean, driving more and more species, thousands of species, to the edge of extinction or, endangering their very existence is nothing to be proud of. Look at our dolphin, for goodness sake. We're about to, the Maui dolphin is looking on the very precipice of extinction.
Yeah, how many of those left?
I think there's, 70 was the latest count that someone's made or something.
Many.
I mean, it's hard to estimate because they're in the open ocean, but it's something like that. It's less than 100 left. I mean, the last country to drive a dolphin to extinction, of course, was China, where they drove a river dolphin to extinction with pollution. We're about to drive an ocean dolphin to extinction.
When John Key says, "Oh look, I'd like to see all the other countries at this summit and how well they're doing," New Zealand's probably doing a whole lot better. To the great unwashed, people go, "Yeah, that's probably right. We saw this bad news around the world all the time." Would it be useful to point out a country that perhaps is doing better than New Zealand?
Well, I mean, if you talk about greenhouse emissions, I mean, there's a whole series of Western European countries who are doing a pretty good job in terms of cutting their emissions.
Just this week, Russell, on that note, it was Germany. Apparently, they've now gone past 50% of their energy generation is from renewable sources like solar and wind. And of course, New Zealand is already there because of our hydro. But it just shows the investment that's been required for a country that doesn't have hydro to the same extent.
Yeah, I mean, Germany's made huge gains in terms of renewable electricity generation.
Yeah.
That isn't our challenge. Our challenge is transport, where the government's going in the opposite direction by investing in new motorways with increasing greenhouse emissions.
Yeah.
And in terms of agriculture. So that's where our challenges lay.
Be also interesting to find out what countries are improving their waterways to a far greater extent than New Zealand are as well.
Well, the Europeans introduced very tight constraints, so they've had very significant improvements in water quality, fresh water quality over the last 20 years. I mean, they said to dairy farmers that, in a number of countries now, they've just capped the number of dairy cows per hectare.
Yeah.
They just said you can't have any more than this because there's no way you can control the effluent going through the groundwater. It's not possible. They've had very significant improvements in water quality. There
was a very good program on 60 Minutes about cows wandering through waterways and the fact that Fonterra really do want to clean that all up and make sure that the fences are in there. But isn't that only one part of the equation? Because then you've got the nutrients leaching from the land, which is a separate issue. Yeah, that's right. I mean, it does make a significant difference if you fence and plant your waterways. The problem with Fonterra is that
they're only identifying large streams. All the little streams you're still free to have your cows roam through. And of course it's the little streams which, are the beginnings of all the large ones.
Yeah.
And even when they do fence, you can fence right at the very edge, and so there's no requirement to plant. Whereas if you're serious about using fencing and planting around streams, you've got to get the streams all the way up to the little wetlands at the top, and you've got to plant around them. And Fonterra is doing neither of those.
So is there a classification problem that these little streams aren't classified as waterways, according to farmers?
It's a Fonterra classification, so under the Clean Streams Accord, if your waterway, at any point when it goes across your farm, if it's narrower than a step, so if you can step across it, or if it's shallower than a gumboot, then you don't have to worry about it. Now, streams change, their morphology changes as they pass across farmland, so sometimes they become deep and narrow, other times they become shallow and flat. So if it becomes shallow and flat, so that at some point it's, you can walk across it without getting water over the top of your gumboot, then you don't have to worry about it.
So, unfortunately, that was left out of the story on 60 Minutes, which ended up being a warm fuzzy at the end when Fonterra said they were going to clean everything up.
There's a lot of really good work going on and a lot of great farmers doing great stuff. But the ones that are serious about it, they don't just put a hot wire right at the edge of the big stream. They actually do serious fencing and planting, and it makes quite a big difference. But you're right, the groundwater stuff's very important as well. What's the nutrient going through the groundwater?
Hey, Russell, thanks very much for your time this morning.
All right. Here's
Khalid of the Greens.